So I'm personally very excited to have you, Dick. I have never interviewed a comedian, no, but I'm really excited. I'm genuinely curious about because I don't know the answers to my questions.
Okay, good. I might not know the answers to your questions either, but we can start.
That would make it even more interesting.
Good.
So first, I was fascinated, or am fascinated, that you just like many of us, you graduated from computer science or something like that, something tech related, but you didn't pursue a career in tech.
No.
Instead, why don't you tell us what you did do?
Yeah, so I had a computer science degree from University of Michigan, and when I graduated, I decided that what I really wanted to do, I had offers from a bunch of companies that don't exist anymore, Honeywell and Burroughs and so forth. I decided what I wanted to do is be on Saturday Night Live. So I turned down all my job offers and went to Second City, this famous improv comedy place in Chicago, which was, where Bill Murray and John Belushi and all these guys had been, and started doing improv comedy there when I graduated. So I got there, in fact, I got there the same day Steve Carell did. Steve and I were in the actually started at Second City the same day, and performed with, all those people, Steve Carell and Tina Fey and Amy Poehler and Adam McKay, and did that for years. And I just had odd jobs, I had to work in nightclubs at midnight to 4 a.m. because it was the only time, because we had rehearsed during the day and perform at night, so the only way I could make money is work at nightclubs. And a guy that was in my graduating class in computer science at Michigan showed up in this nightclub in Chicago at 2 a.m. and I was working in the coat check room. And he was looked at me like, wow, what happened? Anyway, so it was great, and I auditioned for us. So amazingly, after 5-6 years, I auditioned for Saturday Night Live and didn't get in, obviously. But Steve and Tina Fey also auditioned, and they didn't get hired. So I chalked it up to just bad choices on Lorne Michaels' part. Tina ended up getting hired as a writer by Adam McKay, and then worked her way into the show.
This is quite amazing. So I'm skipping a bunch of years, and I'm jumping right into 2010.
Yep.
When you joined what was then, I think what was then already a phenomenon, but not really maybe a company, right? Not really a business model, but many users and weird behavior. But so first, how did it come about?
Yeah.
What did you find when you joined? What were the first few months like?
Yeah, so I actually joined at the end of 2009. I had sold my previous company in Chicago to Google and in 2007. And when I got to Google in 2007, during the sales process with Google, Ev Williams was still at Google because he had sold Blogger to Google, and he hadn't yet left to go start Odeo, which then became Twitter. So I got to reacquainted with Ev during this due diligence process with Google, and when I left Google in 2009, Ev called me and said, look, I'm about to have our first baby. I really need someone to come in and help run operations at Twitter. It was, like you said, it had great user growth. Not only no business model, $0 in revenue, no partnerships that were driving revenue. As many of you will remember, the website crashed all the time. It notoriously had a brand name for the service site not available, the fail whale. It was the only system I can ever think of that had a brand name for its service not available page. And it was great. It was actually a better brand than the bird at the time. It was people had more brand recognition. So that was bad. So I had to come in and sort of deal with all that. And it's one of those, if you go from a place like Google that's got this amazing infrastructure and all these internal tools to, you got to Twitter and it was like, well, what's this internal number? And people were just like, I don't know, that'd be a good number. No, we should go figure that out. And had to build, there was just no company building in place, and we had to build all that from scratch.
What was, what did you see the most impact?
Yeah, well, gosh, all over the place. So I remember when I became CEO in 2010, I'd been at the company for a year as COO, and I remember going up to our communications director and saying, okay, last year, there were dead Twitter birds on the covers of 3 magazines. I think it was exploding on Bloomberg, like the death of Twitter. Fast Company, it was hanging itself, the Twitter bird. And then on like Business 2.0 or something like that, there were 9 different versions of the bird committing suicide. And I went up to our comms director, I was like, okay, low bar, no dead Twitter birds on the covers of magazines next year. That's all you have to do. That's success. So the first thing we had to do just to, was like grow up, And I remember someone got on the elevator one day and was laughing that the site had gone down. It was like, hey, this is like, there are people around the world in Iran at the time protesting against the government in end of 2009, like that depend on this. And the company just didn't get it internally. So I spent a bunch of time in that first year having people on Twitter tell stories via text exchanges at the time with us, so that the people inside the company would get how important it was. And then the other thing that happened is I remember Medvedev came in to the Twitter offices, and the president of Russia at the time, and spoke to us and tweeted out to Obama on Twitter, and we were all at the time, the site was like literally in the process of crashing while Medvedev was on stage. So we're all freaking out, and then the next morning, in the cover of the New York Times, the front of the cover of the New York Times is this exchange between Medvedev and Obama on Twitter as the front headline of the New York Times. And I used that to get up in front of the company to say, like, yesterday while we were like freaking out about the site being, possibly going down, this is what was happening on our service in the world. So, impact is sometimes, you don't recognize impact while you're having it, Impact is what you see when you look over your shoulder and see the wake that's been created by what you've done. And that just happened over and over and over again. I remember during the, what's now called the Arab Spring, but was originally this like protests in Tunisia in North Africa, we had this guy on the platform whose Twitter account name, it's still on there, I think his Twitter account name is Slim404. SLIM404. At Slim404. He's now, or was recently, the interior minister of the government in the newer government in Tunisia, but he was organizing protests against the government in Tunisia on Twitter, and we just kind of thought it was funny. And then a month later realized the platform's being used to organize protests in places that you can't speak out against the government. So it happened over and over again that this impact was something that we saw over our shoulders and didn't recognize in the moment.
It's really, and looking back, what is your biggest surprise? Like if looking back, if you could talk to your 2010 self, what would be the most surprising thing to you 2010 about Twitter?
We just didn't understand the impact that it was going to have, the global, jurisdictional, like geopolitical, socioeconomic impact it was going to have.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you about this. Yeah, sorry.
And in fact, I'll tell you, I remember just another example of that. I'm in my Monday morning staff meeting in the beginning of 2011 with my direct reports, just going over highs and lows and metrics and so forth. And my assistant comes in and says, the White House is on the phone for you. And I was like, what did I do? I didn't do anything. What do they want to call me for? Why do... And I was like, by the way, how do you know it's the White House? Did they just say it's the White House? Like, anyone could say they're the White House. I'm like, hello? And it was Valerie Jarrett. And she's like, hey, Dick, the president would like to talk to you. I'm like, okay. I remember humorously, she's like, do you have a couple minutes? I was like, yes. I think that's the right answer. Anyway, it's just that kind of stuff, no one would, we just couldn't have predicted it, didn't expect it. Even as it happened, you were like, wow. And it happened over and over and over again.
Dick, how would you characterize your leadership style, and to what extent do you think it was informed by your early career as, I don't even know how to call it, improv artist?
Comedian.
Comedian, yeah.
It was informed by that significantly in the following ways. One, I always, one of the things you learn when you're improvising is, in order to make things move along on stage as you're creating this scene as you go, it's important to just always accept what the other person said. It's called yes and. Accept what the other person said as truth and run with it. This big sort of saying in the improv community. And one of the issues you have as you grow, and by the way, this is true of any startup company. Startup company, you're 10 people, like you're moving fast, things are getting done, you're shipping product every week, you can't believe how much progress you're making in the product, and then you're 150 people and you're like, why is everything slowed down here? Like everything is slower now. We hired 10 more engineers and it actually takes longer to get the next version of the product out. Everyone nods when they hear this, right? And so I instituted this, this sort of saying within the company, but it became sort of a mantra of bias to yes. Like assume, because why do things slow down? Here's what happens. People start, they don't want to screw something up, so they go around and ask for permission. Hey, I got this idea to blah, 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 add so-and-so to the product. Can I do that? And then people don't generally say no. They say, you should go ask Dick, or you should ask Oren. Why don't you ask Oren and Dick? You know, after Oren and Dick say yes, go ask the head of security, and on and on and on. And so pretty soon you've got people walking around asking for permission to do things. And bias to yes was, assume the answer is yes, communicate what you're going to do, but do it. And then look, if your boss tells you if you do that, I'll fire you, and you do it, you'll probably get fired. So, but communicate what you're going to do, and then move forward. Assume the answer is yes. You're not allowed to tell anyone in another function, you know, someone in marketing is not allowed to tell someone in product, you're not allowed to do that. And then lastly, bias to yes was, it's not the job of leadership to prevent mistakes from happening. It's the job of leadership to correct mistakes quickly when they happen. You want people taking risks and being courageous. And if everyone walks around on eggshells, that's, you know, that's how things slow down. So my leadership style was very much super communicative and like, you know, bias to yes. If we break things, we'll figure it out and we'll fix them quickly. That's our job as leaders. It's not your job to not make mistakes.
It sounds a lot like Bezos' bias
to action,
right?
Yes.
It's basically the same.
It's basically the same thing.
But
I
yes
incorporated my yes and into it.
Yes comes from my improv,
Yes.
yeah. I took actually an improv class and
I'm sure you were great.
No, I sucked. I really sucked. But that's why I took it. I wanted to get outside of my comfort zone.
Yeah.
So obviously Twitter had amazing, incredible impact, well beyond its market cap size, whatever. Not all of it was positive, right?
Yeah.
What are you most proud of, and what are you less proud of in terms of your contribution to the impact that Twitter has had on the world?
The things that I'm most proud of are the team that we had there and what they've gone on to do and the people the leaders they've gone on to become. I mean, just ran into Katie Stanton here, who's now an investor, and ran our media team at Twitter after I lured her back from the White House, and then went on to be CMO at Color Genomics, and is one of the investors in #Angels, this group of women leaders at Twitter who became investors together. Just the leaders we developed there and what they've gone on to do, and the head of go-to-market at Airtable now, Liat Baisel, is worked for Adam Bain and I at Twitter, and she's gonna be an amazing, you know, she's a CEO of his company someday. She's just an incredible leader. So that's probably the thing I'm most proud of when I think about the team that we had and we built and the relationship that all those people still have inside the company. I know you were asking about the platform, but that's the thing I'm most proud of. Yeah. On the issues side, I think the challenge that if I could go back to 2010 and tell myself, you know, one thing, as you said earlier, I would be way more aggressive about abuse. And in the following way, we had this sort of thesis inside the company that, you know, all accounts are created equal. And in fact, you still see people at YouTube and Facebook and Twitter talk about, well, we've got to have a consistent policy and a consistent way of dealing with these accounts, and that's why it's so hard to craft these policies. And I actually don't believe that's true. I actually don't believe you should treat an account that was created yesterday that has 2 followers the same way you treat the New York Times. But the problem is these companies try to come up with these policies to dictate when they will or won't take an account down. Yeah. And of course, the bad guys navigate the fine line between, well, it's not really a violation of the policy, but anyone who looks at this tweet or comment would know this is an abusive comment. Common sense tells you this is an abusive comment. So it's a challenge to say you can't treat all these accounts equally because, well, then everything's subjective. But I do think that all of these companies need to get away from, we're going to have one consistent policy that we apply to all accounts equally. You should think of, big media accounts, the Washington Post, the, Le Monde, whatever, El País, Le Monde, New York Times, as wildly different and treated differently than an account that was created 4 days ago that's just screaming at everybody. So I think that until YouTube, Facebook, Twitter implement policies like that acknowledge a difference in the kind of account, they're just going to continue to run into all these problems, and they won't be able to deal with these things at scale, and will look like they're just behind the curve on dealing with them. When you've got people inside the company scrambling to deal with these things every day, but because of the way they try to treat every account equally, it's just impossible. I'll give you a great example. I mean, it may seem obvious, but then you run into all these interesting examples where you're like, oh yeah, what would you do? So we have this policy, you can't show somebody physically harming another person on Twitter. So ISIS, remember they light these pilots on fire inside these cages, it's horrible. They video them and take these photographs of them, and they start posting them to Twitter. Well, of course, we immediately like, hey, my general counsel tells me we're gonna suspend any account that posts these videos or photos. Sure, of course. Well, the New York Post posts the photo that we've been suspending any account, and we announced we're going to suspend it. The New York Post posts this photo because it becomes the front page of the New York Post the next day. Okay, now what do we do? So now we get all these like, why aren't you suspending the New York Post? Yeah. Anyway. So a long way of saying, like, if we could go back and do one thing that we should have done dramatically differently, it would be that, and I think it continues to hamstring these companies.
And so it's been 4 years, right? By the way,
Yeah.
How did the tenure come to an end?
So at the end of 2014, I'll tell you exactly how it came to an end. When I became CEO in 2010, Jack Dorsey was the executive chairman of the company, and I became CEO in 2010, and Jack was still chairman. I went up to Jack and I said, "Hey, when you want to be when you want to be CEO again, just let me know. I'm like taking care of the shop, and we'll build the business, and that's great. But it's your guys' company. I'm just in here to be an operator." And that was like fall 2010. So it's now the end of 2014. We're a $30 billion public company. We've gone from one office, 45 people, and a website that didn't work, to $2.2 billion in revenue run rate at the beginning of 2015, 30 offices around the world. I've got a fatwa on me from ISIS, and I haven't seen my daughter in like 6 years. She's a senior in high school this next year. And I go up to our lead independent director, Peter Curry, and I'm like, "Hey, this has been great. It's been 6 years. Like, I kind of thought someone was going to tap me on the shoulder, in the last couple of years and go, thanks for all the help. So I don't care whether it's, I think it was like December 20th, 2014. I said, I don't really care whether it's New Year's Day 2015 or December 30th, 2015. You all pick. You go to the board and pick. But one of those days is my last day. So it got to be May 2015, and the board has had 0 discussions with me about this. And so at our board meeting in May, I said, hey, I think you guys think you can just like run out the clock on me and I'll stay. I'm leaving December 30th and not coming back if nothing's been decided. So anyway, they picked up the pace at that point, and Jack and our GC and I got together and proposed that Jack take over on an interim basis. That since it had been decided that I was going to leave, I should, let's do it now. And then, of course, as you all know, Jack became the permanent CEO. They removed the interim title a few months later, I think.
Does he consult with you to this day?
No, Jack does not consult with me. Jack talks to me. We're good friends, and we're having dinner again in a couple of weeks. And when I was CEO of Twitter, Jack and I would go out to dinner every Tuesday night. We went to Zuni Cafe on Market Street every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. The funny thing about that was I would go to, so it's like 3 years or 4 years that I think we started doing it in 2012, so 4 years. Every Tuesday, 7 p.m., Zuni Cafe on Market Street. I'm not kidding. I would go in at 6:55, and I'd go to the front counter, and they'd go, "Can I help you?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's me again. I'm back." And Jack would walk in, they'd go, "Jack!" And I'm like, That kind of always happened with Jack and I would get, a stack of mail at Twitter, like, Dick Costolo, CEO of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, CEO of Twitter. I was like, he's not even doing the job, and he's getting more mail as the CEO than I am. This is like 2012, 2013. We would walk down the street together, and having some conversation when people come up to us and go, "Are you Jack Dorsey?" And then they hand me their phone and go, "Can you get a picture of us?" So, anyway, that was all frustrating until the ISIS death threats came around, and then it was great.
Yeah. Maybe that's why I didn't make it to SNL.
Yeah.
Do you ever give him constructive criticism on what? Because I think that the negative impact of social media in general, not just Twitter, became more apparent in the last 2 or 3 years for political reasons. So does it ever come up, and do you think that they can really do much more than they are doing, other than not treating everyone equal?
Yeah, I always think that more can be done, and I thought that when I was CEO, we were too slow to deal with it, and I even said that publicly at the time. So I do think that a lot more can be done, and I don't think they're intractable problems. I give advice when I have things to say to people in the company that I think, hey, you should check out XYZ, it's generally not me texting Jack because I know how busy Jack is. So I'll talk to the general counsel, Vijay Gade, or head of marketing, Leslie Berland, and I send them to those people instead of to Jack. Jack doesn't need another text from me telling him what he should be doing.
Got it. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about the Silicon Valley.
Yeah, the TV
show. Not the
show.
place, the HBO show. It's HBO, right? So I don't know if everyone here knows, but you did and do play a role, right? So,
I consulted for the show starting in season 3, and have stayed involved here and there in it. So I got to go back to my comedy roots, which was great.
Excellent. So share some interesting stories with us.
Yeah. So the funny thing about the people who work on the show Silicon Valley in Southern California and LA, who are comedy writers and comedians, and if you talk to people in Silicon Valley here, they'll all tell you, wow, it's crazy how accurate that is. I can't watch it because it gives me PTSD. So the amazing thing is companies here will pitch ideas to the Silicon Valley writing team that are themselves things that they should be ashamed to be pitching, I'll just make fun of one thing, but don't tweet it out and get me in trouble. And if the CEO of the company's in here, I'm sorry, but it's happened. So Soylent, the company Soylent, sends this case of Soylent to the writer's room at Silicon Valley, and along with this, you'll never need to eat anything else. You can just have Soylent every meal all the time, and here it is, try it out. And of course, the writing team is a bunch of, they're not these aren't high-performance athletes. These are people who are eating burgers and fries and in the writer's room all day. So it tries this Soylent, and they're like, oh my God, it's horrible. Pass it around the table. And so they wrote this whole scene where Guilfoyle, one of the software programmers on Silicon Valley, tries Soylent, hates it, and makes Guilfoylent. And it's a big hit until it kills somebody, and then they ended up, HBO was like, you can't put that in the show, so I cut it out of the show. So it's actually people up here who are pitching things to the show that become their own, they're not. And I remember we came up here once with the writing team and went and talked to 5 different companies in a building. This actually became one of the first scenes, I think, in season 3 or season 4. I think season 3. And you go down and talk to the company, just, tell us what you do here at company X. Could be Yelp, could be whatever. So first of all, the people in the writer's room love that all the companies up here have a name for their employees. Yelpers, Googlers, Brightlings at Eventbrite.
Housers.
Yeah. Tweeps at Twitter. I mean, they're you guys realize this is stupid and you all do it, right? And it's not creative and original. And I'm like, yeah, I know. I don't know why everyone continues to do it, but they do. And then more interestingly, every company we would go into, irrespective of what the company did, they'd say, we're not just, Silicon Valley people, we're not just changing the way documents are signed here at DocuSign. We're changing the world. This is going to change the world. Of course. And so the writing team's like, you guys realize the guys downstairs who draw the fake mustaches on people also say they're changing the world, And so they tried to come up with this, and I think it's the first scene in season 3. What's the stupidest idea we could have for a company? And it was drawing virtual mustaches on people. And then have that guy pitch Richard, Richard, this is going to change the world. It's going to change the way people look at one another. And anyway. So it's people up here who write the show for them.
All right, but now you decided to change the world and become
move to the other side of the table.
Yeah, exactly. So tell us about that.
So I mean, as you can imagine, when you're running this 4,000 person company, and you're a public company, so you're dealing with all your public market investors, and when you're running a 4,000 person company, everybody's crisis is your crisis. I'm making this up, but if the VP of marketing in the Tokyo office has some, personal crisis, it's your personal crisis too. And you just develop this like tunnel vision about it's Twitter 24/7. You wake up. I remember I was at this CEO conference, and Ken Chenault, the CEO of American Express, was on stage talking about the basement. And he said, the basement is 3 a.m. when you wake up and you press your head together and you're like, oh my God, I'm gonna like ruin this company. And I thought to myself like, oh, hey, he does that too. It's not just me. But you just develop, and you're constantly thinking about the company, no matter what. And so the beauty of, and you stop learning because you're just like focused on this one thing, and you stop sort of seeing anything outside the tunnel. And the great thing about investing is, man, you learn a ton. I went and visited this company in Los Angeles, Relativity Space, that's 3D printing rockets. I mean, I have no idea whether it's going to work or not, but it's like they're 3D printing this 12-foot wide fuel cell. It's unbelievable. And you just learn about all these things that you would never know anything about before. And the flip side of that is, while you're learning a lot, you also find that these CEOs are all dealing with the same kinds of problems. It's like, hey, my vice president of engineering is undermining, says my vice president of marketing is horrible, and these people are talking about each other. This person's not part of the team. I made this decision, and nobody knows. Why doesn't anyone know what this decision was? I communicated it 4 times, but people don't seem to know what the decision was. It's just on and on and on. No matter what the company is doing, it's the same problem after the same problem after the same problem. So hopefully the beauty of being on the investing side after having been an operator at scale like that is I can come in and help them diagnose those things and go, stop selling, Here's a classic mistake a company makes as they're pivoting or transitioning rather, from building a product to building a business. That Twitter 2010 moment. Got all the users, now how are we going to make money? One of the classic mistakes a leader will make is, oh my God, this horrible thing happened with this customer. Have to institute a process to make sure that never happens again. And then, cut to 8 months later and you're the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States or the TSA, and you're having people take your shoes off to put them in the bin, but you don't know, we're just managing to a process instead of managing to outcomes. And so, I try to, hopefully I can recognize that stuff and remind these CEOs, like, don't solve, and this is again for all the CEOs in the room, don't solve problems with processes, solve them with ownership, operating structure, and responsibility, not processes. And so while you learn a ton and while there are lots of different ways to be successful, it's lots of the same problems.
Yeah, and I can attest that both Ariel from Trip Actions as well as Chen from Tipalti, both of which companies Dick and Adam recently invested, Tipalti more recently than Trip Actions. I can attest that they see it as invaluable. The kind of advice they can get from both of you, actually. So I think
we're looking forward to digging in more with Chen as well. I'm going to sit in on one of his management team meetings.
Awesome. I don't know if he's here, but I know he's supposed to be here today. So you are here? Okay, I can't see.
So Bill Campbell, famous, the guy who used to be, he was on the board of Apple and he was friends with. He was on the board of Apple and friends of Steve Jobs, and then he was famously Sergey and Eric's coach at Google, and they just wrote a book about him, $1 trillion coach. He also coached Adam and I at Twitter, and lots of what we do is like, stuff that Bill just helped us with, like stop making all the decisions, let the people own their own decisions, stop telling people what to do. If there are 2 people disagree on your team about what to do, tell them to go away and come back with a single proposal. So you get the team working together as a team. All that stuff that Bill is great at is just the same thing we do now. The only thing different is Bill used to sit in the back of our management team meetings, and when something would happen that he agreed with, he would go, And that drove me absolutely insane. Like, Bill, stop clapping when you agree with what someone said. People are starting to perform for you. So I don't clap.
Yeah, that's good. He helped us at Chegg as
Yeah.
well, and I think Dan from Chegg was also one of the writers.
Yeah, that's right.
Or one of the
Yeah,
writers,
that's
I think,
right.
one of the stories. Let me.
Dan Rosenzweig is. I had a great, quick Dan Rosenzweig story.
Okay.
The CEO of Chegg. Do you mind? Is it okay? So the day I announced to the company, I get up in front of the whole company, June 11th, 2015. I get up in front of the company and tell them, "Hey, I'm resigning. I'm leaving. Jack's going to take over as interim CEO." Katie Stanton, who's here, has a meeting scheduled with Dan Rosenzweig, the CEO of Chegg. But Dan is sort of locked in the lobby because emergency all hands, security shuts the doors, no one knows what's going on. I announced to the company I'm resigning, tears and don't go, and that was from 2 or 3 people, but I like to think it was from thousands, in the audience. And I remember one of the people started crying. I was like, find an engineer who doesn't care. And I saw one in the back room. I'm like, all right, I'm going to look at that guy the whole time who's like bored. Anyway, after the meeting, Jack Dorsey has this really long beard at the time. He has it again now. And Dan comes in after the meeting's over, Dan Rosenzweig, and Jack is sort of this introvert and is just kind of standing there next to me. And Dan gives me this big hug and said, "You did a great job. You did an amazing thing here." And he looks at Jack and goes, "How's it going, Rabbi?" And they, by the way, they'd never met before. So that was Dan's way of introducing himself to Jack.
Yeah, typical.
Yeah, typical Dan Rosenzweig.
So I'll open it. Yasmin, how much time do we have? Okay, I'll open it now for some questions from the audience so I don't get all the fun to ask questions. Anyone?
Yeah, it's a great question. The question for those of you who can hear is about board governance and things like this migration to more of the Google model of the founders have voting control of the company and so forth. I mean, and Google's actually a good example. I think when that all started, it was fine because that this mechanism, the founders having voting control and can kind of do what they want, because if you look at the example of Google, it'll enable them to do things that might not have otherwise been able to do. Make acquisitions they probably wouldn't, that a board may not have unanimously approved. Look at Facebook buying WhatsApp. If Mark could spend $20 billion on WhatsApp because Mark, all in favor say aye, and Mark raises his hand. And so he gets to buy WhatsApp. And you can make these audacious, bold moves as a founder CEO, and I think that's great. The challenge is, of course, it's started getting abused and piled on with even more sort of ridiculous eyebrow-raising terms like, my niece gets to name, if I quit, my niece and her friend Phil get to name my successor. I mean, it's kind of, I'm not making this up. Some of these terms that are in there are ridiculous and are being abused, and that's just going to invite more regulation, which is unfortunate, because I think there are mechanisms and reasons you want founder control of a company to help that company be able to move quickly and make audacious decisions and not have to have 14 people vote on something. As Bezos likes to say, consensus decision-making and compromise are a bad way to come to conclusions because you probably don't reach the right conclusion. If it's how high is the ceiling in here, if we all vote on it, it's probably not the right way to find out how high the ceiling is. It's one person deciding, I'm going to figure this out and tell you what it is. Unfortunately, there's more and more WeWork examples now that are just going to reinforce to the SEC and others at some point that you can't list on the exchanges unless you have these kinds of governance policies, et cetera. And that's probably coming sooner than later. It's already started, and I expect we'll see more of it. So it's an unfortunate abuse of what had initially been a pretty a cool mechanism for founders and CEOs here. I do also think that just board governance, generally speaking, hasn't been what it needs to be recently in many, many cases. And it takes, what does that mean? What does that end up meaning? It ends up meaning that you get public market activist investors who become the sort of de facto board governance. Like, well, if you guys aren't going to do it, we're going to come in and take a position and beat you into submission. And some of those activist investors are okay, and some of them are not okay. So it would behoove Silicon Valley to come up with a better solution around board governance.
Okay, anyone else? Yes.
Yes, thank you.
With the hindsight that you have,
I don't know. Can I?
Sorry.
I can't believe I have the honor to ask you a question. It's really kind of a fundamental question. You know, the right of free speech is such a fundamental right. I mean, we all take it for granted in this country, but in many other countries in the world, it's not there. I personally believe it's something that is one of the most fundamental concepts, right, of a free society, the ability to say anything. You have the right to say anything, right? Did you guys ever consider to take the exact opposite approach and say, you know what, we are going to carry the torch of free speech, meaning you can say whatever you want, and if you offend 8 billion people, that's fine with us, because, you know, we don't want to police anything. We don't need to decide anything. If you don't want to listen, you don't have to follow that individual or that account. But basically, we are not here to say what's right and what's wrong. We are just going to say, we are for free speech. Now, if you post very bad stuff, you know, maybe the police will knock on your door. That's a different thing. That's not in your control. But you as a company that basically say, we are letting anyone say whatever they want.
Yeah, I'm smiling because that's precisely what we did in 2010, 2011, and 2012. In fact, I was on stage at the, I think it was called the All Things D conference at the time, the Kara Swisher, Walt Mossberg thing, and I told Kara Swisher, we're the free speech wing of the free speech party. Like, you say something on Twitter, like, we're not there to police it. And the long and the short of it is that just becomes an untenable position as, you know, if you're trying to use the platform and everything shows up with equal weight in the conversation you're trying to have, everything devolves into people shouting at each other. So it just became untenable to continue that way. You know, I remember Robin Williams died, and these random accounts, for whatever stupid reason, just kept tweeting pictures of bodies in a morgue to Robin Williams' daughter and saying, like, hey, this photo of your dad was just released from the hospital. It wasn't Robin Williams, but, like, you know, well, okay, now Robin Williams' daughter can't use Twitter anymore. So, you know, you play that out, and guess what? Pretty soon, only these idiots who are yelling at each other and the trolls are using the platform. So we had that position, and we just felt like it became untenable. And now I think the company needs to go even further and say, actually, all accounts aren't equal. The person who created the account 2 days ago and has one follower, who may be a bot, we don't know yet, isn't going to get the same rights and privileges as the New York Times.
And the gentleman, yeah, go ahead.
Having the hindsight of being a founder and an operator and CEO, and now you're transitioning to investor, what kind of industries or types of companies or platforms like get you excited in terms of looking into the future?
I mean, these enterprise software companies that have like negative churn, so they just don't do anything, and they have a churn of 100, you know, the revenue grows 150% year over year. Twilio, Okta, you know, Zoom, you know, CrowdStrike, there's another one's going public every week now. These are amazing companies. I mean, like, you know, hey, we had 1,000 seats last, you know, and then in private market, there's tons of them. Topology, Airtable, we've just talked about, Trip Actions. They're awesome investment opportunities and awesome companies to be involved with, and the CEOs and leaders of these companies getting to work in an environment where you're making even more money from the same person you sold to 4 years ago, you know, tomorrow, and you're expanding your market, because also every industry now is a technology industry. So these enterprise software companies who could previously only sell to other tech companies are now selling to, you know, I don't know, auto parts manufacturers, you know, you name it, real estate companies, on and on and on. So, wow, there's just like going to be, like, for a while, amazing investment opportunities in enterprise software companies. And that's why you're seeing some of these things perform. So, you know, Datadog just recently, that's why you're seeing some of these things perform so well in the public markets. Public market investors realize this is where the growth is. This is where the growth is going to be for a while. They have infinite TAM, infinite total addressable market, as more and more, as software continues to eat the world. So that's the short answer to your question.
Do we have anyone? Yeah.
I do also think, you know, so sorry, doing this thing that Susan Wojcicki used to do to me at Google. I used to work for Susan at Google. I would show her a slide. Any questions? No. And then I'd just start to go to the next slide, and she'd ask the question. So even if I tried the trick of pausing an extra 10 seconds, she'd wait. All right, the one other thing I want to say is I do think there's sort of a dearth of consumer companies, internet consumer companies that are out there raising money right now that are exciting. But that goes in waves. There will be I don't know, Airbnb will come public. It'll probably do really, really well, and you'll see another whole swath of interesting consumer companies. I don't buy into all the consumer ideas that's never the case. All the consumer ideas are done, and you see some people talking about that stuff. There will be another wave of amazing consumer companies. We're just not in one right now.
Yes, over there.
So if the Rabbi Jack calls you for an advice today, what would you tell him?
My advice to Jack would be, the people inside the company know Jack, and I personally know Jack to be this super empathetic, really thoughtful, careful thinker, and funny and kind and warm and generous, but he's an introvert. So when he's speaking publicly, he seems like impenetrable and abstract, and people have like, what is he saying when he's answering this question? And it's basically just because he's an introvert. He's learned how to overcome that internally. People inside the company now know him as the person I do, and I would just encourage him to be more like that when he's speaking publicly. He tends to kind of go a little bit more into his shell, and you can look at any of the recent public interviews he's done and the feedback about them. People tend to like, what is he trying to say? And he's just, he's just not as comfortable in front of the, in front of the camera as an extrovert like me. And the more he does that, the more people understand him, and I think the more they realize he's a great leader. And I would encourage him to be more open when he's speaking publicly.
Maybe you should do improv.
Maybe he should take some improv classes. I'm happy to be his coach.
Anyone else? Or we?
We have 5 minutes.
Well, okay. What's that?
We have 5 minutes, so if anyone has questions?
Okay, so we'll give back the 5 minutes to Icon. We'll pay it forward to Icon. And thank you so much,
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Dick.
Thanks for being here.
And it was a pleasure and a privilege to have you on stage.
Thank you.